Good morning. I'm Joel Wenger, the political director with Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our president and CEO, Mark Melman, our board and board co-chairs, Ann Lewis and Todd Richmond, and all of our staff, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. I want to take a moment to express the MFI's gratitude for you all joining us given the ongoing war in Israel. We are sending our condolences to the families of those murdered in Israel, our wishes for speedy recovery to those wounded, and our hopes that the hostages will be reunited with their families soon. We will always stand united with Israel. In just a minute, I'll turn it over to our board member, Alma Hernandez, to introduce our distinguished guests. But first, I wanted to briefly update you on some of the activities we've been doing. We've continued to be in constant contact with our allies on Capitol Hill through briefings and sharing materials. We've encouraged Democrats to speak out and condemn Hamas, support aid to Israel, and other important legislation, such as Brad Sherman's bill calling for increased scrutiny of UNRWA's teaching curriculum during their schools in Gaza and the West Bank. And we've mobilized our base to send letters and calls to Congress, urging lawmakers to support Israel with an aid package and oppose a ceasefire until the hostages are released and Hamas is disarmed. Please consider following us on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at DemMaj, M-A-J, the number 4 Israel. You can see our handle in the on-screen graphic. Finally, some housekeeping items for today. If you want to ask a question, submit it through the Q&A feature on your Zoom interface. Or if you're watching on one of our social platforms or one of the live streams, you can enter a question in the comments section. Now I'm very pleased to introduce and turn it over to DMFI board member, Alma Hernandez. Alma.
Hello, everyone. Great to be with you all today. I have the great distinct honor and pleasure of introducing Colonel Pnina Sharvit Baruch, who heads the program on law and national security at Israel's Institute of National Security Studies. She was also the head of the International Law Department of the Military Advocate General Unit at the Israeli Defense Forces for 20 years, where she was a senior legal advisor responsible for advising IDF commanders on issues related to international law and armed conflict. During her service, Colonel Sharvit Baruch also served as the legal advisor in Israel's delegation during negotiations with the Palestinians. We are so grateful to have Colonel Sharvit Baruch here with us today to discuss Gaza and the law of war. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation, and I will start with a few comments, and then a lot will come in the questions. So as was said, I was in the International Law Department for 20 years. I headed the department for 5 years. And in this capacity, I was also involved in the as a legal advisor in the rounds of negotiations with the Palestinians, what is known as the Oslo Accords, and in negotiations since then. And even after retiring, I retired in 2009, I'm still involved in trying to find a solution to the conflict, including research, but also in track twos with Palestinians. I was supposed to be this week, actually, in Europe, discussing with Palestinians how to solve the conflict. But I was also in charge. I was the legal advisor on operational issues, and I was actually the commander of the mechanism of operational legal advisors who advise in the IDF, the military commanders, on issues on different legal aspects of fighting. In this capacity, what we are involved, or what I used to do, and what the department does today, is in general, we want to have the law, and the law is incorporated into the operational plans, into the whole issue of targeting when we discuss pre-planned targeting, and this is when we are not in war, questions about measures and means and legality of practices. So we are involved in all this decision making, making sure that the law is incorporated inside the system, not as a legal annex, but that because we want to abide by the law, we appreciate that's very important for us. It also corresponds a lot with our moral standards, and that's also something very important. When there is an ongoing war like now, then we have legal advisors in shifts giving advice 24/7 to the commanders from the division level up, so in division level, in the command level, and in the general chief of staff level, and to the government. The challenge of applying of operating in our conflict is very big, because what we are facing is an enemy. Hamas is an enemy that on the one hand, of course, disregards the law, so is not bound by the law in any way, and of course carries out, and we saw here the most extreme war crimes, crimes against humanity, even genocide, and also doesn't adhere to any other rules of the laws of armed conflict. It targets civilians on purpose, targets our hospitals, and of course uses its civilians, the Palestinian civilians, as a shield, and doesn't try to make any kind of separation between the military activity and civilian infrastructure. So we have this enemy that disregards the law, but still we need to abide by the law because there's no principle of reciprocity. And what that means is that we need to apply the principle, the main principles of the laws of armed conflict that are relevant, which is the principle of distinction, the principle of proportionality, and the obligation to take precautions. Now, what does that mean? It means that under the principle of distinction, you are not allowed to direct attacks against civilians or civilian objects, just against military objectives. And here's the issue. According to the law, military objectives include also civilian objects that by their nature, location, purpose, or use contribute to the military activity of the enemy. This means that the military activity and the military infrastructure of the Hamas is a legitimate target, even if it's in civilian objects. And that's the reality that we are facing. All of the military capabilities of Hamas and of the Islamic Jihad, or almost all of them, are inside and underneath civilian buildings in the Gaza Strip, including houses and schools and mosques and hospitals. Underneath the main hospital in Gaza, we have headquarters, but it's under all these kinds of buildings. Now, when Israel attacks these buildings, these kinds of objects, it is a legitimate attack, it is a lawful military target, but what you see afterwards is civilian buildings that have been destroyed. So while it is legal, it is very difficult to explain this legality again to the wider audience that faces the pictures. The second principle is the principle of proportionality, because even if you're attacking a lawful military objective, that's not the end of the story. You still have to make an assessment of the military advantage sought from the attack and the collateral harm to civilians expected from the attack. Now, according to the law, it is legal, it is lawful to attack a military objective if even if you know that it might cause harm to civilians, as long as this anticipated harm to civilians is not excessive in relation to the military advantage sought from the attack. Which means that with regard to each target, you have to think you have to assess the military advantage and what is the expected collateral harm. What we are facing is a situation where almost every attack against these military objectives, because they are inside the civilian object and because there are many civilians there and the Hamas doesn't allow the civilians also, it prevents civilians from leaving, and some stay anyway, but so we always have this possibility of harm to civilians. This does not mean that the attack is unlawful, because as I said before, the test is whether this harm is excessive. And if the military advantage is very big and we are facing a very, very vicious and dangerous enemy, therefore the military advantage of dismantling it from its military capabilities, and each part and parcel of this military capability, these are military capabilities that pose a very serious threat to Israel's security, to the possibility of people living inside Israel. We have 200,000, 120,000 Israelis that are internally displaced Israelis from the south, and another 80,000 or more from the north. So people have been uprooted from their houses. They are either been destroyed or it's too dangerous to be there. So the threat is huge. So the military advantage is also very large, which means that legally, even if civilians, if a significant number of civilians might get harmed, this does not mean necessarily that the attack is unlawful according to the laws of war. But again, we have this issue of the legitimacy, because what you see afterwards is many civilian casualties, and immediately Israel is accused of acting with disproportionate force. And here, just a word about the numbers, and I know is that we also have to remember that the figures and the facts are also very uncertain, because the numbers that we see of casualties, they are numbers that the Hamas publishes. So first of all, many times it's exaggerated, and we know the story of the hospital, and can talk about it later if you don't know about it. But anyway, it also doesn't make any differentiation between civilians and the combatants of the Hamas. So even if we are attacking a stronghold of the Hamas and killing dozens of Hamas operatives and also some civilians, they're all counted as civilians. And again, there's also the fake. We have footage of body bags that have been taken, pictures of body bags, and then you see the people moving inside them. So we don't really know the numbers. We have to be very cautious with the numbers. And again, I'm not saying that there aren't civilian casualties. There are civilian casualties. I don't know about the number. But anyway, the fact that there are civilian casualties doesn't in itself mean that Israel is carrying out any kind of war crime. The laws of armed conflict were created by militaries that are fighting, taking into account the complexity of an armed conflict situation. But when we get the public court of public opinion, things are not viewed in this way. And then we face this very difficult uphill battle of explaining what we are doing and gaining the legitimacy in the international arena. There's more to say, but I'll stop here. And
all right. Thank you so much, Pnina. We really appreciate it. And now I will be going ahead and introducing our guest, Geoffrey Korn. He is the George R. Killam Jr. Chair of Criminal Law and Director of the Center for Military Law and Policy at Texas Tech University School of Law, and a Gensa Fellow. Professor Korn served in the U.S. Army for 21 years as an officer and a final year as a civilian legal advisor, retiring in the rank of lieutenant colonel. His career included service as the Army's senior law of war expert advisor and chief prosecutor for the 101st Airborne Division. He has appeared as an expert witness at the Military Commission in Guantanamo and the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and in federal court. We are so glad to have Professor Korn here with us today to discuss Gaza and the law of war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and especially a pleasure to see my friend Pnina. I know how hard she's been working, and I think that she's covered many of the issues quite effectively in a very short period of time. I want to focus on a couple of key points I think that are really important to keep in mind as we assess, or we try and assess, the legality and morality of what we're seeing occur in Israel. Let's start with a basic principle of the law called equality of application. I saw a question in the chat as to whether or not Hamas follows the law, and if not, what remedies are there. One thing is very clear. It doesn't matter whether you're a state or a non-state group. All parties to a conflict are equally obligated to the basic rules of war. So there's no distinction between the rules that apply to the conduct of hostilities by the Israeli Defense Forces or Hamas. They're bound by the same principles and the same rules. Now, of course, we know, as Pnina noted, that Hamas routinely violates the law, but it's very important to recognize that that in no way releases the Israeli Defense Forces from their obligation to follow the law. Creates a tremendous challenge for operational commanders, because you're sending young men and women into battle knowing that they're fighting an enemy that doesn't care about the law, but you still have to follow the rules. It also creates an irony that in many cases, it's the Israeli Defense Forces that are trying to mitigate civilian risk against an enemy that's actually trying to exacerbate that risk in clear violation of the law. So I would suggest to you that we shouldn't only think about the attacks that Hamas launches on Israeli civilians. In my view, Hamas is responsible in large measure for much of the suffering we're seeing in Gaza, because they are exploiting the presence of their own civilians in order to gain tactical advantage, or in order to put the Israeli Defense Forces in a situation where they have no other option other than to attack, cause civilian casualties, and those casualties are leveraged in the strategic information campaign. And in this regard, I think it's important to recognize that in these type of conflicts between states and non-state armed groups like Hamas, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, these groups do not use combat as a measure to defeat their state opponent on the battlefield. Hamas knows it cannot defeat the IDF in battle. They use combat as a supporting effort for their information campaign, because the real battle they want to win is the strategic misinformation campaign. And so they use their combat operations to set those conditions. The second point I'd like to emphasize is self-defense and the scope of the right of self-defense. There's a lot of misunderstanding that the right of self-defense on the part of a state that's a victim of an armed attack is limited to what we might call tit-for-tat self-defense. They fire a missile, you're allowed to fire a missile. They kill 2,000 civilians, you're allowed to kill 2,000 civilians. That's just simply erroneous. The right of self-defense is defined as a principle of necessity. The state is authorized to do all that is reasonably necessary to restore its sense of security and the security of its population. And what happened on October 7th, in my view, is that the Israeli assumption that it could use very limited measures in self-defense every time there was a flare-up of hostilities with Hamas was thrown in the trash bin. In fact, and Pnina knows this, I've been of the view that in prior conflicts, Israel would have been legally justified in taking much more robust action against Hamas. They chose to rely on a defensive shield as a method of limiting their self-defense response. But they realized after October 7th that that shield is not sufficient to ensure their safety. So we have to be very careful when we talk about the obligation of Israel to terminate operations prematurely before they achieve their strategic self-defense objective, which is to eliminate the ongoing threat, particularly when you have Hamas leaders publicly stating that October 7th will be repeated over and over again until all Jews in the Holy Land have been killed or driven out. Third point, when we assess the legality of conduct of hostilities, it's very dangerous and misleading to engage in what I've called effects-based condemnation. That's when you look at the effects of an attack and you make an assumption or a conclusion that it must have been illegal. There are a lot of assertions that Israeli attacks are amounting to war crimes in Gaza. Those assertions are based on the visual evidence of destruction and harm to innocent civilians. As Pnina noted, the law of war, as harsh as it may sound, tolerates the knowing infliction of destruction of civilian property and death or injury to civilians, so long as that's not your intended objective. So there's a very clear distinction between an enemy that intends to attack civilians and an enemy that intends to attack military targets and cannot avoid harming civilians. When we look at those results and jump to the conclusion that there's a war crime, it's analogous to saying 1 + I don't know = 10, because the law does not define compliance based on the results of an attack. The law defines compliance based on the judgment to launch the attack. And in order to assess the legality of that judgment, you need to know much more than what the outcome was. You need to know what the intended target was. You need to know the value that was assessed for that target. You need to know what measures were implemented to mitigate the risk to the civilian population without compromising the military advantage. And then you need to know the ultimate assessment of proportionality, which is based on a prediction of what the consequences will be to civilians and civilian property. Without all that information, it's simply impossible to look at the effects of an attack, particularly when you're dealing with an enemy that's using the civilian population as camouflage, and conclude there was a war crime. A good example of this was the recent attack in the refugee center. The immediate media reaction was to ask the question or to point out that Israel, as a result of the attack, inflicted significant numbers of civilian casualties. And by the way, I agree with Pnina that we are at the mercy of Hamas when it comes to the numbers of those casualties, because there's no independent verification. But the first thing that went through my mind was, why was there a high-level Hamas commander in a refugee center? That's the question we should be asking, because by doing that, Hamas is unnecessarily exposing those civilians to the consequences of combat operations. And again, I believe in many cases they want that to happen. I've called this indirect civilian targeting, when you essentially bait your enemy into launching an attack in order to create civilian casualties, because that's your ammunition in the misinformation campaign. I think there's another very important point. Pnina talked about the rule of distinction and the rule of proportionality. And I know, and she knows, that between those two is lodged another critical principle, the rule of precautions, right? Whenever a commander is going to launch an attack, and I don't care whether it's a platoon leader with a tank or a general with an air force, whenever a commander is going to launch an attack with knowledge that the attack will place civilians at risk, the commander is obligated to implement what the law calls all feasible risk mitigation precautions. So the commander has to consider options that will reduce the risk to the civilian population without compromising the military advantage. Warnings, timing of attack, weapons package, alternate tactics. Is there a different way I can achieve my result without attacking that specific target? Verification of the accuracy of my intelligence and the true nature of the target, the weight of the target. This is routinely integrated into IDF attack decision-making processes, as it is in US practice. And in my opinion, this is a much more significant risk mitigation methodology than what we love to focus on, which is proportionality. Because proportionality is by its nature inherently ambiguous. So when I say to a commander, you're not allowed to attack that target if you believe the civilian risk will be excessive compared to your military advantage, the commander is going to look at me and say, what is excessive? And I don't have an answer for that. The law doesn't have an answer for that. It can't be reduced to a formula. But if I look at the commander and say, isn't there a different weapons package you could use to achieve that result that will reduce the civilian risk? The commander can look to the weapons officer and say, what are my other options? Or do we have to attack in the morning? Could we attack at night? Or are we able to issue warnings or maybe encourage evacuation, whatever the case may be? This is under the rubric of constant care. What we should demand of all professional military commanders and decision makers is that in the execution of their operations, they're constantly balancing military necessity, which is the right to use all your power to bring about the submission of your enemy, with constant care to mitigate the risk to the civilian population. By the way, that goes to one of the questions I saw about, could Israel be doing more to help the victims in Gaza? For example, creating a humanitarian safety zone on the Israeli side of the border. That should be something, in my view, they are considering, because that would fall under that rubric of constant care. I think it would be complicated, and my guess is Hamas wouldn't let people leave, but at least you try to do something that would ease the suffering of the civilian population without compromising your military advantage. And the final point I'll make is the danger of conflation. There are different issues that are complex and legally and morally challenging in the region. Pnina talked about being involved in negotiations for Oslo and for the implementation of the Oslo Agreement. Issues related to Palestinian self-determination, settlement activity in the West Bank, the final status of the West Bank. Those are distinct from questions related to law, legality, and the conduct of hostilities. I don't purport to be an expert on the former category of issues. My expertise is in the law of war and the rules related to the conduct of hostilities. And I think we have to be determined to separate those issues, because when we conflate them, then it's just people passing in the night when they're trying to discuss this. Joel, I think that's about 10 or 12 minutes, so I'm sorry if I went over.
No problem. No. I can tell that your questions and I can tell by the questions that we're receiving that both of your comments have not only been insightful, but have been very stimulating for our audience. And I want to remind folks to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen if you're watching on Zoom, or if you're on one of our social platforms, you can use the comments feature to ask your questions. So for this first question, I'll go to Pnina. So, I know Professor Korn addressed this slightly, but would it be helpful to Israel if Egypt or other Arab nations would take in civilian Palestinians? What efforts are being done in this respect? How difficult would it be to prevent Hamas fighters from slipping through and joining civilians in such a humanitarian effort? This question is from Scott L.
So first of all, Jeff added the precautions because I didn't have enough time, but of course precautions is very important, and I think to try to minimize harm to civilians is there's a legal obligation, but and it's a moral obligation, but it's also in Israel's interest. So Israel has no interest in many civilian casualties in a humanitarian crisis. It's actually counter our interest. It just puts pressure on Israel, and again, our enemy is the Hamas, not the Palestinian population in the Gaza Strip that are themselves hostages of the Hamas. So that's a very important point to make. I think with regard to Egypt, we have to be very sensitive. Any kind of idea that the Egyptians can perceive as trying to push Palestinians indefinitely into Egypt. And there have been some ideas raised by, I would say, also some research institutes, some experts. It was also attributed to one of our ministers, although it wasn't really, it was a report written by a research institute that part of the solution could be transferring Palestinians from the Gaza Strip to Egypt. I think that's a very problematic idea because, of course, forcing them to move out is a problem legally, and also because from Egyptian perspective, this is a very sensitive issue, and they don't have any. They're not ready to that. And a different thing is to accept certain injured people, sick people, to come to a hospital. There are many ideas and attempts to organize hospitals also within the Gaza Strip, also potentially floating hospitals. There's also talks with Egypt of having some kind of hospital on their side. It's again in Israel's interest to see to it that there is a medical that whoever needs it gets medical attention among Gaza. By the way, I saw a question there about why don't we allow water and food and medical stuff into the Gaza Strip? We do. At the moment, there's no restriction on the entry of all these. The only thing is that they are transferred from Egypt through the Rafah crossing and are subject to inspection to see that they're not using these introducing weapons or other kinds of products that will help the war effort, and that it's really food and medicine and water. But we are supplying water. The Hamas, by the way, bombed a part of the infrastructure, and Israel was repairing it to provide it. So we're not preventing that. Only the fuel, and there's a lot of fuel in the hands of the Hamas, and we know that if we introduce more fuel, they will just take it, and instead of it getting again to the hospitals the way it is needed, it will go again for the military effort. They already did it. They already came and stole fuel from UNRWA to use for their military operations instead of giving it to the hospitals. So here, and there's no legal obligation to supply fuel. So again, the idea of having Egypt and other countries help with the humanitarian effort is on the table. It is being discussed, but moving Palestinians to Egypt, not so much.
Thank you for that. This next question will go to Geoffrey. This is from Mark W. What are the legal consequences of Hamas using human shields? And does it relieve the IDF of any obligations to minimize harm to civilians?
So first off, I would encourage people to I think the use of the word minimize civilian harm is problematic because it's effects oriented. The obligation is to mitigate civilian risk. That's a That's a judgment decision. So I can mitigate civilian risk in the attack planning process. When we say minimize, it's subtly shifting our focus from the decision making to the outcome. And that plays right into that kind of effects-based distortion of the legal assessment that is problematic. But the answer to the question is no. No matter how abusive Hamas is of international law, no matter how much they exploit their civilian population, Israel is not released from its obligation to take all feasible measures to mitigate that civilian risk. But of course, what it does is it influences what is a feasible risk mitigation measure and how much you can do to avoid that risk. And that's the sad reality of what we're seeing. I wrote an article a couple of years ago that basically was arguing we have to be careful about conflating cause with responsibility. It's easy to identify the cause of civilian suffering. If a bomb is dropped, you can point to the aircraft that dropped the bomb and say that caused the suffering. What's much more complicated is assessing legal responsibility. And when the enemy is using the civilian as a shield, in many cases, they bear the responsibility for that suffering. And by the way, I do want to I saw one question that's related to this. You don't lose your protection as a civilian because you may favor Hamas, or you may have voted for Hamas, or you support Hamas. That doesn't turn you into some type of quasi-combatant. You lose your protection as a civilian when you either join the enemy armed group, and Hamas has brigades, they have armed forces, or you take a direct part in hostilities by providing some direct support to the military operations, like gathering intelligence, or picking up a weapon and firing, or building bombs for Hamas. So even if we say that many of the civilians in Gaza are supportive of Hamas and hate Israel, that doesn't relieve the IDF of its obligation to take all feasible precautions to mitigate the risk to those civilians. And it's a tragedy. It's a tragedy because the enemy that Israel's fighting knows they win one way or the other. If they put their command post under a hospital, one of two things is going to happen. Either Israel is going to refrain from attacking it, in which case their command post gets immunity, or Israel is going to feel compelled to attack it, making an assessment that they've mitigated as much risk as possible. There'll be images of destruction of a hospital, casualties to civilians, and then Hamas will use that in their information campaign. What we really should be condemning forcefully is the consistent, pervasive, and illicit abuse of the civilian population to shield targets and to actually get them killed, which is an aggravated form of human shielding.
Thank you. John A. asked, and I think this is in line with kind of Geoffrey's response for you, Pnina, what else could Israel be doing to save innocent Palestinian lives? We talked about evacuating civilians, areas captured by Israel potentially, or bringing more medical equipment into Gaza. We talked about floating hospitals or hospitals on the Egyptian side of the border, because really Israel should be going beyond the legal minimum to be humane. So what more could Israel be doing, do you think?
So again, as I already pointed out, it's in Israel's interest to have as minimum harm to civilians as possible, and Jeff put it so well, this win-win strategy of the Hamas, and we have to also understand that when the international community actually works as planned for the Hamas perspective and puts all the pressure on Israel, this is just an incentive to do it again. So to a certain extent, by the fact that it works, it just means that they will do it again and again and always use against the civilians as shields. So one way of also protecting the civilians, I think beyond what Israel can do, and I'll come back to that, is also, I think by making it very clear that these kinds of tactics won't work, not to ISIS and not to Hamas. Because otherwise, again, they don't have any value to the human lives of the Palestinians. There was an interview I don't know how many of you saw an interview of one of the senior Hamas leaders in a Russian TV, and he was asked, why don't you let the civilians, when there are attacks by Israel, go into the tunnels? Everything, there's an underneath town, yes, in the Gaza Strip. And he said, no, the tunnels are for our military use. And anyway, 75% of the Palestinians are refugees, so they are the responsibility of UNRWA. So just to understand what we are facing now, Israel, so again, the one thing is to give these warnings, and that's why Israel is trying to persuade as many people as possible to move south, because the operations now are focusing mainly on the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Israel stops, it has corridors, specified corridors to allow the people to go south, and avoids attacks in these corridors. What the Hamas does, first of all, in some cases, it's shooting those Palestinians in order to persuade them or to prevent them from moving south. And in other cases, what it does those things. It fires rockets from there, because so Israel can't respond. So we know that when we have these hours that they can move, we will have more rocket attacks. So again, this is their strategy, but still Israel is trying to persuade people to go to the south. And so that's one means, and as Jeff said, using ammunition that is more accurate, trying to really focus the attacks and even the direction in a way that will mitigate or minimize harm. These are things that are done as a routine issue. And as I said before about the humanitarian aid, yes, we are allowing the introduction into the Gaza Strip of humanitarian aid, of food and water and medical stuff, and we are inviting medical floating hospitals and other kinds of potential hospitals. So we are trying to minimize or to mitigate and to have less harm to civilians. It is still very difficult to do, again, because it's such a densely populated area, and because of the tactic of the Hamas that is doing everything in its power to have more civilian casualties, so which makes it a very challenging effort.
Thank you, Pnina. This next question is from Robert, and we'll go to Geoffrey with this one. Geoffrey, you've spoken a bunch about how Hamas utilizes civilian populations and things to kind of give this perception that Israel is going above and beyond what should be reasonable. But given the way you've explained this and outlined this and the steps that Israel takes, how can this information best be framed to combat the media war? What can Israel be doing better, or what can supported Israel be doing better to combat this framing in the media?
Boy, if I knew that, I probably wouldn't be teaching at Texas Tech. But look, this is very difficult. I want to emphasize something. I completely understand the natural human reaction to seeing a father in the news carrying his deceased child or wounded child as a result of an attack. Anybody who is not moved by that is candidly a sociopath. I mean, it's tragic. War can be lawful and awful. That's what soldiers know. And what troubles me so much is the kind of implicit dismissal of the humanity of the people that are having to fight this war. What we know for sure is simple. There is one side of this conflict that is intentionally trying to kill civilians and is completely indifferent to the plight of civilians in its own area. There's another side of the conflict that's trying to attack military objectives and trying at least to use measures to mitigate civilian risk. In my view, there's no moral equality. So for me, the biggest danger is this effects-based condemnation, that you look at these tragedies, the tragic consequence of war, and you make an assumption that there are war crimes. It's interesting. I heard a member of Congress make a comment that Israel is committing war crimes. Well, individuals commit war crimes. What pilot are you accusing? What commander are you accusing? They have to live with the consequences of their operations. They come from a moral society. I just reject the idea that the IDF is composed of a bunch of people who have complete indifference to the suffering of war. That certainly wasn't my experience dealing with them. It was never my experience as a soldier in our own army. my commanders were intensely cognizant of the consequences of their combat operations, but they had a mission to accomplish. So again, I think the answer goes back to Pnina's point. We have to consistently emphasize the illicit tactics used by Hamas, and that whatever they perceive their cause to be, it doesn't justify deviating from the basic rules that are designed to mitigate civilian risk. And those rules apply to the attacker and the defender. And I think we also have to acknowledge that when you put troops in combat, they have a mission. The mission to destroy Hamas requires that they do, it was T.F. Fehrenbach, a great author, who said, you can bomb it, you can pulverize it, you can drop things from the air, but if you really want to defeat your enemy, you have to do it the old-fashioned way. You have to put your young men and women in the dirt and close with and destroy the enemy. That is a brutal mission, and there will be suffering as a result. But what is the alternative? That we tell the IDF not to attack targets, which will further incentivize the abuse of the civilian population by Hamas, by Al-Qaeda, by ISIS, and by future enemies? It's a terribly difficult equation. So I guess at bottom, I would say, before you start asserting what is illegitimate or illegal or immoral, take a little time to understand the law, how the law is designed to regulate the conduct of hostilities, and also the nature of military operations and the challenge of battle command, because they're all integrated into this equation.
Can I add something?
Go ahead.
Another question.
Go ahead, Pnina.
So first of all, just to the point that was made about the morality, just to note that until a month ago, we were having every week a lot of protests against the government, and they were headed also by these pilots that are now fighting there and other offices in reservists. And one of the points was that we want to make sure that we are only abiding by moral laws. And so the part of the criticism against this government was that that they were concerned about the values. So this is a very important thing for us all. So that's just to add. But I think what the problem with that we face in the international arena is deeper than just the civilian casualty. That's of course a huge issue, and again the pictures are very dramatic. But also, I think this idea that Israel is this oppressor, Palestinians are the victims. There's a very black and white kind of and misunderstanding of the complexity of the conflict. When actually Hamas is not fighting for ending the 1967 occupation, it's not fighting for improving the lives of Palestinians. Actually, on the 6th of October, we were exactly in a situation where we were opening up the Gaza Strip, allowing workers into Israel, giving a lot of money to improve the infrastructure there. Some of the people murdered in the kibbutzim were actually peace activists that were working on opening and operating joint industrial areas and commercial areas between Gaza and Israel. They were driving Gazans to the hospitals in Israel that couldn't get treatment in Gaza. So, and the Hamas is opposing the right of Israel to exist and the idea of any kind of peaceful resolution of the conflict. When you hear the slogans of Palestine will be free from the river to the sea, this is not about the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This is about the state of Israel. So, and it's very difficult. So and most of the Palestinians that do want to live peacefully near Israel, the Hamas is their enemy too. But this complexity just doesn't. We don't manage to explain it, and when Israel is perceived as the bad guy, then everything we do is also perceived, and we are the strong ones, and they are the weak ones. And also, Hamas is not weak. Hamas managed thousands of terrorists, managed to enter into Israel, into military bases, into villages, into 22 villages and towns. For hours, they were slaughtering and torturing and killing and kidnapping Israelis. this is a very strong enemy, and we have to add that this is not an enemy operating on its own. This axis with Iran and Hezbollah and the Shia proxies that are just waiting to see what will happen. We are having also rockets fired from Lebanon at the moment, and we had missiles fired from Yemen against us, and they're all waiting to see. And if Israel is perceived as weak and is unable to meet this challenge of the Hamas, they will all come for the kill. So Israel is fighting here as an existential threat. This is also to the question about Mosul and the difference. The difference is that we are fighting an enemy or enemies that want our destruction and could actually happen. That's why I said beforehand, we are so thankful for President Biden, who came and supported us and brought the aircraft carrier. This is so important for our existence, and this is also something that is we don't manage to transmit this this to international media, unfortunately.
Well, thank you, Pnina. The question that she was alluding to, I think, that you just alluded to, I think is worth kind of going further into.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember the name of the person that asked it, but during the full question was, during the Battle of Mosul, there were incredibly strict rules on bombing targets, despite ISIL using human shields and utilizing civilian infrastructure, in part due to the concerns with complying with the laws of war. The current bombing in Gaza is, as far as we can tell, far more aggressive with more permissive rules of engagement. What assurances can we give to the IDF as hitting targets that are verified to be Hamas rather than purely civilian targets? So since you alluded to this question, Pnina, I'll give you the opportunity to directly address it further first. And given that there are some...
And maybe Jeff can answer afterwards. So I'll just start and Jeff can add. First of all, again, I'm explaining this is not civilian targets. Okay, we are not attacking civilian targets. It's against our interest and again against our rules and against our law. But anyway, these are military objectives that are hidden inside these what looks like civilian targets, civilian buildings. So that's and that also was the case of the U.S. fighting against and the coalition forces fighting against ISIS. Because by the way, on some of the bodies of the Hamas fighters that were in Israel, there were flags of ISIS. And what they did by beheading babies and things like that, they took these ideas also from ISIS. So there's a link there. But anyway, this is the challenge also the US and coalition forces had. And the law, as I said, I explained why the law still allows to attack even if you know that there are civilian casualties. I think the level of threat is relevant. The US was fighting an enemy that was, of course, a very dangerous enemy for the safety of the world, but it wasn't under, the US wasn't under direct threat to its existence from ISIS. So I think if it was, it would have impacted the military advantage from attacking ISIS targets, and it would have maybe acted differently. And again, there were many civilian casualties in Mosul too. So we have to maybe Jeff has the figures. There's always, I know the President Obama at a later stage had a policy of restraining of zero civilian casualties, but that's not the law. That's a policy. You can decide as a policy to have a more restrictive policy of attacks. But again, when you're fighting for your existence, when you're fighting for the lives of the people that are under direct threat, it's a bit of a luxury to have to put more these kinds of restrictions. So I think we don't have any Western country, I mean, this Ukraine now, that has been facing since Second World War this kind of threat that we are facing. And that's why you have to think, what would you do if you were facing this kind of threat? And Jeff, maybe you can add.
Yeah, let me just add, I think we have to be very, very cautious about these comparisons. The level of destruction in Mosul during the 9-month campaign conducted by the Iraqi armed forces, supported by U.S. Special Operations Forces, who were relying on indirect fires and air attacks, was enormous. I mean, the city was leveled. So I'm not sure where this strict rules of engagement in Mosul come from. The JSOC operators that were in Mosul were relying extensively on calling for fire support in support of Iraqi forces from artillery units that we had in Syria and from air and and drone operations over Mosul. As a matter of fact, there was a story in, I think, Military Times or the New York Times yesterday or the day before about the trauma that the artillerymen that were in Syria are suffering now because of the enormous volume of fire that was placed into Mosul. I can remember being in Israel back after the 2014 conflict with the retired Marine Corps general who commanded the Battle of Fallujah. And he looked at the density of fire by the IDF and he just shook his head. He said, this was nothing compared to the density of fire we used in Fallujah. And so, but ultimately, the real question is, what's your objective and what are you trying to do to verify it and mitigate risk? That, to me, should be the touchstone of analysis. And we should not forget that when people acknowledge, well, what happened on October 7th was certainly a war crime by Hamas, every single rocket they have fired towards Israel since October 7th has been a war crime because they make no pretense of trying to attack a military target. They are intending to attack civilians and civilian property. The fact that they fail to achieve their goal every time doesn't negate the criminality and the illegality of those attacks. So again, you have an irony. They're launching attacks on civilians and they're failing to achieve the result. So we don't pay much attention to that. Israel is launching attacks on military targets. They can't avoid inflicting civilian casualties, but that becomes the focal point of international condemnation. In my view, that's the consequence of too much focus on results, not enough focus on process. If we want civilians to be protected, then we have to demand respect for their lives, not only by the side that's attacking, but also the side that's defending.
Thank you, Jeff. We'll go just do one more question. This last question, we'll start with Pnina on it, but Jeff, you can feel free to chime in as well. This question comes from my colleague, Rachel Rosen. How is Hamas able to invade Israel's southern communities on October 7th and cause such widespread damage? You know, what did the IDF do wrong, in your opinion?
Wow. Well, since we are in war, so the whole issue of how did it happen, we have a little bit put it aside because you can't be doing our internal investigations of what went wrong, and definitely a lot went wrong, and also engaging in fighting the enemy. It's the same commanders that were in command on the 7th of October are now commanding the military campaign. So there are many questions, and I think one of them, there were misconceptions about the Hamas. There was an idea that the Hamas maybe is becoming a little bit more pragmatic. As I said before, there were a lot of attempts to improve the lives of Palestinians in Gaza. A lot of money was entered into the Hamas from Qatar, that we thought they are also will invest it also in Gaza, making it a better place. That was the idea in the first place of disengaging from Gaza, to have them rule themselves. And this was, of course, a misconception. They were using everything just to build their military capabilities. And I don't think we anticipated that they have such sophisticated military capabilities. There was too much reliance on technology. Israel became a small military. We are a small country, so the idea was to have less military forces, to shorten the military service, and to focus a lot on technology. So we relied a lot on technology, and they managed to dismantle all the technological, they had very good intelligence, all the technological capabilities. That was the first thing they did, and then we had no eyes and no ears. And so there were many failures, but I think, and of course there's the failures of the, I think of the political level. We're not talking about it here, but I think, I believe that we need to reach a peaceful resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians. So I think the policy of this government and previous governments for quite a few years of thinking that not to deal with the Palestinian issue, we just push it aside and it will solve itself if we disregard it, was a big mistake. And that I thought in real time, and I think now it makes it even more clear. But again, this is not, the Hamas again is not after reaching a peaceful resolution of the conflict. We needed to strengthen the moderates and not the extremists. So many mistakes were done. At the moment, we don't have the time. We cannot afford to deal with that because we are still fighting for our lives. I'm sounding a bit dramatic, but we're having sleepless nights, not only thinking about the horrors of what happened on the 7th of October, and also the anger of the world and the slogans that we hear and the anti-Semitism all around the world, but also worrying about the future. Will we be here next year? What will we do with Israel? We are really shaken. So we will deal with this after the war, whenever that happens.
Joel, I started my career as an intelligence officer, not as a lawyer, right? And one thing you learn very quickly is for every measure, the enemy will figure out a countermeasure. It's a constant game. In 2014, the countermeasure was subterranean infiltration. The IDF didn't expect it. Hamas built these tunnels and they were caught off guard. So the question you asked, how did it happen? Or the question that was asked, we could have asked that question of General Gamelin in 1940, when the Germans defeated the French in 6 weeks. We could have asked that question of the Israeli Minister of Defense in 1973, when the Bar-Lev line was breached in 6 hours instead of 2 weeks. What I think is important from this is to recognize that if you think groups like Hamas are, throwing stones with slingshots, you're sadly mistaken. These are adaptive, capable, and competent military forces. And their competence and their effectiveness is ultimately enhanced by their knowledge that they don't follow the rules of war, but their enemy is bound by those rules of war. That contributes to their effectiveness. So I think, this is just another reminder that defenses only go so far in protecting a nation from a determined enemy. And the myth of Iron Dome, which was always, well, Israel can sit behind Iron Dome and it doesn't have to worry about anything. I've been involved in reports with these generals, as I mentioned, since 2014, that have been saying that is a false assumption. If you know you have a determined enemy that's determined to attack you, you have to be prepared to defeat the enemy by using the full spectrum of military capability and political and diplomatic. As Pnina says, you're not going to drive a tank through the ambition of Palestinians to have their own state. That's a separate level of this strategy. But if you think you can hide behind a defensive shield in complete comfort, we know that's not true, because the enemy will always figure out some way of overcoming your defensive capability.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for that additional insights. It was really, really helpful. Thank you, Pnina. Thank you, Jeff, again, for all of your thoughts that you shared with us. I know that all of our folks.
Can I just say one sentence?
Sure,
really
go for it. Apologies.
Because we didn't raise it until now, and there's the issue of the hostages, including a 9-month-old baby, well, he's already 10 months old, and a 3-year-old girl who's lost both her parents, and elderly people. And I think really that there needs to be as much international pressure as possible on this issue, so we can save at least some of their lives. So I felt it important to mention that too.
Definitely. We definitely acknowledge that at the top of the call. I will also note that starting in 30 minutes, there's going to be a press conference on Capitol Hill with some family members of 5 of the Gaza hostages and Congressman Brad Sherman. So it is on the top of the mind of many of our allies on Capitol Hill as well. And it's a thought that most of us don't go very long without thinking about within our organization. But thank you again, both for joining us for this, for all of your thoughtful comments. For those who are watching and asked if there's a recording, the recording of this, like all of our events, will be on our website, dmfi.org, in the DMFI Live section. And I'm now going to turn it over to our board co-chair, Ann Lewis, to close out the event.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Colonel Pnina Sharvit Baruch, Thank you to Professor Geoffrey Korn for taking time out of your, I know, busy schedule, but you joined us for such an important conversation. Thank you for bringing clarity and understanding to a complicated topic. I think all of us feel that we know more. We are better educated because of the conversation you just led us in. This has been an unimaginable month for everyone who cares about Israel's future and the safety of Jewish people around the world. Like you, and as you've just said, we are praying for the safety of the IDF troops fighting Hamas and the release of the more than 200 hostages held by Hamas, including babies and children. As Joel said earlier, we're working around the clock to ensure that the Democratic Party remains supportive of Israel. I may say how appreciative we are of your appreciation of President Biden, who is making us proud in this difficult time. We've been in constant touch with Democratic members on the Hill. We've been providing briefing materials and information. We urge our supporters to speak out, mail, call, reach members of Congress in support of Israel's efforts to dismantle Hamas. We talk to the media regularly to make sure the voice and perspective of pro-Israel Democrats are heard, and we are aggressively pushing back on disinformation online and calling out a small but very vocal group of Israel detractors within our party. We know we could not be doing any of this without the help of our friends and supporters. You help us and help DMFI keep the Democratic Party pro-Israel and strengthen the U.S.-Israel relationship. We are deeply grateful. So please, if you haven't already, sign up to stay in touch with us at dmfi.org. Follow us on social media at, here it comes on the screen, DEMMAJ4, number 4, Israel, DEMMAJ for Israel. And if you'd like to donate today to help support our vital work and future events, please click the link in the chat or visit our website. But most of all, thank you for taking time to listen and join this important conversation. We look forward to seeing you again as we all work towards a better time.